Hey, what's up guys?
I'm Bronze.
I'm Zing, and welcome to Mage, episode 2, card types. So we're so excited because we're going to be sharing with you how to read Magic the Gathering cards. We're going to be going over the different types of cards, as well as how the cards are actually formatted, so that when you find a card that you haven't seen before, you'll be able to know exactly what it does. Hey, what's up guys? Bronze here. So let's get straight into Magic the Gathering. In Magic the Gathering, there are 7 different card types. We have lands, artifacts, creatures, enchantments, instants, sorceries, and planeswalkers. Now, 5 of these, being lands, artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and planeswalker cards, are what are known as permanents, meaning that once you cast one of these onto the battlefield, it stays onto the battlefield until otherwise interacted with. Conversely, that means that the other 2, instants and sorcery cards, are not permanents, meaning that once you cast one of these spells, then you read the card, you do what its ability says to do, and then you take that card and you put it into your graveyard. The graveyard being where used spells and destroyed permanents go. So while we're on the topic of permanents, let's start by talking about land cards. Now, land cards are super important because they allow everything to happen. They're what allows the game to progress. And the way that they can do this is producing what is called mana. Now, mana is used to pay for spells, for cards, and for abilities. Now, with land cards, you can only place 1 land card on the battlefield per turn, meaning if you're on turn 1 and you have 3 land cards in your hand, you can only place 1 of those land cards onto the battlefield. The other 2, you'll have to wait for successive turns in order to place them onto the battlefield. Now, when you have your land card on the battlefield, in order to produce mana, you have to do what is called tapping. Now, tapping means turning a card sideways, signifying that its tap ability has been used. We'll get a little bit more into abilities a little bit later in this episode, but for right now, there are many different abilities, and some of them they all have different costs. One of those costs is tapping. Now, tapping, as I said before, means turning a card sideways. And once a card is turned sideways, it is considered tapped and cannot be tapped again until it has been untapped. Now, the beginning of your next turn, right before you draw a card, is when you can untap all of your cards, so you'll be able to use those tap abilities again. There are 5 colors in Magic the Gathering. We have white, blue, black, red, and green. And each of these colors is associated with a specific type of gameplay or of synergies that they have. So we'll start off with white. Now, white typically deals with life gain, as well as having creatures with a large amount of toughness for defense, as well as creating large armies with really small creatures. So typically 1/1s or 2/2s. Now let's move on to blue. Blue is typically associated with counter spells and with gaining a card advantage. So they'll be able to draw a lot of cards on their turn, as well as be able to block or counter any spells that your opponent casts. Moving on to black. Black typically deals with destroying creatures and using their graveyard almost like a second hand. Moving on to red. Red typically has creatures with a high amount of power, but low toughness. So kind of like glass cannons. And they also have a lot of spells that deal damage directly to creatures and to players. Finally, we get to green. So green is typically associated with having a large mana pool so that they can cast these really large creatures onto the battlefield. Now, each of these colors is associated with a specific land card. So we have white plains, blue islands, black swamps, red mountains, and green forests. There's also what are known as colorless wastes, but those aren't typically used. You won't see them very often because colorless wastes produce colorless mana or generic mana, which is only can be used to pay for those gray number symbols that are next to the regular colored symbols on a card. So everything that I have just been describing refers to basic land cards. These meaning, place the forest down, tap it, and produce 1 green mana. Pretty simple, pretty basic. That's why they're basic land cards. But there are also land cards that don't exactly fit this mold, and they're called non-basic land cards. And whoever came up with that name deserves a uniqueness reward. So these non-basic land cards typically have one or more ability other than tap, produce 1 mana of a specific color. So let's take Haship's Oasis, for example. It has 3 abilities. The first one being tap, produce 1 generic or colorless mana. Its second is tap, pay 1 life, and produce 1 green mana. Its third is tap, pay mana, sacrifice Haship's Oasis, and then you can boost or power up one of your creatures that are already on the battlefield. Let's start going over how to read cards. So if there's a card in your hand that you want to cast onto the battlefield, you need to be able to pay its mana cost. So let's take Elvish Mystic here as an example of a card you want to cast. If you look in the top right corner, you can see 1 green mana symbol, meaning that you need to tap 1 to produce 1 green mana in order to pay for this mana cost to cast it onto the battlefield. If you look on the other side of the card, you can see its name, in this case, Elvish Mystic. And then below you can see an artistic representation of this card. And then below that on the left side, you can see the type. So earlier, as I said, there are 7 different card types in Magic the Gathering. In this case, it is a creature, elf, druid. But there's the other 6 types to go through, and if you were to see a sorcery card or a planeswalker card, the name, the planeswalker or sorcery would be right there in that spot. Now there's also what are known as legendary cards. So a legendary creature or a legendary planeswalker or a legendary artifact, something like that, are legendary cards. Now these cards are typically more powerful for what the mana cost is than regular normal cards. And to compensate for this, there is a legendary rule, meaning if you have a legendary creature on the battlefield, or any legendary card, if you have a legendary creature on the battlefield and you have the exact same legendary creature in hand, you cannot have both legendary creatures on the battlefield at the same time. So say I were to have 2 legendary planeswalker cards in hand. I cast one of them, and I either have to wait until this card is destroyed, or I can cast my new one and destroy the other legendary planeswalker. I cannot have 2 of the exact same legendary cards on the battlefield at the same time. Now, if you look on the right side of the card from the type, we'll see its rarity. So there are 4 colors of rarity in Magic the Gathering, and like legendaries, the higher up you go in rarity, typically the more powerful the card becomes for its mana type, mana cost. So there is black, which is common, silver, which is uncommon, gold, which is rare, and orange, which is mythic rare. Now also, this symbol will change because it reflects which set this card came out in. Now if you look below that in the big box, the top of it typically has its ability or what the card does. And then below that, sometimes you'll find flavor text. In this case, with Elvish Mystic, it has the ability tap and produce 1 green mana, as well as some flavor text below that. Lastly, you'll see on the bottom right, there's a little box. It has 2 numbers in it separated by a backslash. So this represents the creature's power and its toughness. In Elvish Mystic's case, 1 power, 1 toughness. So power represents attack, dealing damage, and then toughness is how much damage it can withstand. So Elvish Mystic is not a very powerful card and it can't resist a lot of damage, but its ability is what it's mainly used for. So now let's talk about creatures. So creatures are cards that you cast onto the battlefield to attack your opponent as well to defend against your opponent's creatures. Now, once a creature enters the battlefield, it has what is called summoning sickness, meaning that it cannot use its tap abilities or attack that turn that it has been cast. So let's take Vayashino Pyromancer as an example of a creature. So as you can see in the bottom right, it has 2/1. This refers to its power and its toughness. Power meaning how much damage it deals, and 1 being how much damage it can take. So once a creature its toughness reaches 0 or below, then it is destroyed and it moves over to your graveyard. Now, Viashino Pyromancer has an ability when it enters the battlefield, then it deals 2 damage to either a player or a planeswalker. So this means that you cast it, and then it enters the battlefield and its ability activates. So it's not affected by Summoning Sickness because it's not a tap ability. Next, let's talk about sorcery cards. So sorcery cards are cards that have many different abilities that can be cast. So these cards, when you cast them, you activate their ability, and then once their ability resolves, then you take that card and you put it in the graveyard because it's not a permanent. So let's take Lava Coil as an example of a sorcery card. So it needs 1 generic mana and 1 red mana in order to cast it. And then once you cast it, you select a target creature and deal 4 damage to that creature. Now if that creature takes more damage than it has toughness left, so if it reaches 0 or below in toughness, then instead of destroying it and moving it to the graveyard, you instead move it into the exile pile. Now, exiling is very different than graveyard because once a card is in exile, it's really hard to get it back. In fact, it's nearly impossible. So that means if you put a card in the exile pile, it's a lot more difficult to play around with it. So the thing about sorcery cards is that they can only be cast during 2 parts of your turn. Your main phase and then your second main phase. So the main phase comes after your untap step and after you draw. Then you can, cast spells, you can put land down, you can put creatures down, all that good stuff. And then you move on to your attack step. So once your attacks are over and all the damage has been dealt, then you're in your second main phase. Now that's the other time that you can cast these sorcery spells. Once your second main phase is done, then you move on to your end step, and then it's your opponent's turn. So sorcery cards can only be cast during one of those 2 phases. So now we get to the sister card of sorceries, the instant card. So instant cards are basically the same thing as sorcery cards, except for the fact that you can cast them at basically any time. So instant cards are sorceries that you can cast at any time. Let's take Shock here as an example. So Shock, it requires 1 red mana in order to cast, and what it does is it deals 2 damage to any target. So a player, planeswalker, doesn't matter, creature, any of those things are available targets for Shock. So as long as you have 1 mountain open to produce red mana, then you can cast it. So let's move on to enchantments. So enchantments are basically permanent versions of instants and sorcery cards. So let's take Charge and Glorious Anthem as examples. So Charge is a 1 white mana cost, and what it does is it takes your creatures that are on the battlefield and it adds 1 to their power and toughness. So if they were a 1/1, then they would become a 2/2. Glorious Anthem does the same thing, except it's a 1 white to cast, so 1 generic mana and 2 white mana. And once you put it onto the battlefield, then all of your creatures on the battlefield also get a +1/+1 to their power and their toughness. The only difference is Charge lasts until the end of turn, whereas Glorious Anthem lasts until it leaves the battlefield. So while we're on the topic of enchantments, there's also subtypes of enchantments, some of them being Aura, Curse, and Saga. So we're just going to focus on Aura because it is one of the more common types of enchantments that you'll find. So Auras are different than just regular enchantments because they focus on one specific permanent. So we're going to go over 3 different auras in order to help you understand a little bit about how these work. So we're going to start off with Blanchwood Armor. Now what Blanchwood Armor does is when you cast it and put it on a creature, then that creature gets a +1/+1 to their power and toughness respectively for each forest that you have on the battlefield. Now, so if you have a 1/1 and you have 3 forests on the battlefield, then it becomes a 4/4. Now the thing about auras is that if the creature that you put it on gets killed, so it takes more damage than it has toughness, then it goes in the graveyard and your aura also goes to the graveyard. Another example is Deadweight. So what Deadweight does is it puts a -2/-2 on power and toughness respectively for a creature. So you typically wouldn't want to put that on your creatures, but you most definitely want to put them on your opponents. So you take this card and you put it on your opponent's creature, and it then reduces its power and toughness by 2. So if you put it on a creature and its toughness gets reduced to 0 or below, then it gets destroyed and moves to your opponent's graveyard. That means that Deadweight also moves to your graveyard. Now, the last aura we're going to go over is Gift of Paradise. So what Gift of Paradise does is when you cast it and put it on a specific land card, first off, you gain 3 life. And second, that land card which you put it on gains the tap ability, tap, and add 2 mana of any color. Now let's talk about artifacts. So artifacts are very similar to enchantments, except they're typically colorless, meaning that you can put them in a wide range of decks because they don't have a specific mana color associated with them. Now, artifacts are very versatile, from Immortal Sun, which takes care of planeswalkers, to Oblivion Stone, which blows up the battlefield. They just have a lot of versatility. Now, within artifacts, there are several subtypes. You have vehicle, clue, and equipment. So the one we're going to focus on is equipment because that's one of the more common types of artifacts. So let's take Colossus Hammer as an example. So it takes 1 to cast, and you cast it onto the battlefield, but then there is an additional equipped cost. In this case, 8. So it takes 8 mana to equip Colossus Hammer onto a creature. And once you do, then Colossus Hammer's ability activates, and that creature, if it had flying, no longer has flying and gains a +10/+10 to its power and toughness. Now the thing about equipment is if your creature is destroyed that it was equipped to, then that enchantment doesn't leave the battlefield. So unlike Aura, which if the creature is destroyed goes to the graveyard, the equipment just moves back onto the battlefield and you can equip it again to a different creature. So now we get to our final card type, Planeswalker. So Planeswalkers are probably some of the most unique and powerful cards that you'll have in your deck. Planeswalkers are similar to players in the respect that they have a life total, loyalty counters. So let's take Nicol Bolas Dragon God as an example. So he starts off with 4 loyalty counters. Now, just the same as creatures, if his life total or his loyalty counters reaches 0 or below, then he'll be destroyed and he'll go over to your graveyard. So what your opponent wants to do is take their creatures or any spells that they could use to drop the loyalty counter down to 0. So your creatures have the ability to choose whether to attack you or to attack your Planeswalker, and you can defend as normal. Planeswalkers typically have 3 abilities, usually a plus ability and 2 minus abilities. So Nicol Bolas Dragon God has a +1 ability, a -3 ability, and then a -8 ability. Now the last one, the -8 ability, is typically referred to as their ultimate ability because it's the game changer. It's typically what allows you to win the game. Now, with loyalty counters, with these abilities, especially these minus abilities, if you have a loyalty counter, say Nicol Dragon God has 1 life on him, 1 loyalty counter, then he cannot cast either his -3 ability or his -8 ability. You have to be able to match or exceed the number in order to be able to cast it. So he has to have at least 3, if not more, in order to cast his -3 ability. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. We had a lot of fun making that and hope that you had as much fun watching it as we did making it.
Yes, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and ring that bell, because you'll definitely want to see our future videos.